before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. The Carrian brothers had always been inseparable. Gary and Ted Carrian were more than just siblings. They were best friends, business partners, and dreamers. Together, they had built a fast food empire, expanding their Sonic restaurants across Louisiana. Their journey was one of perseverance. Two men with an unstoppable drive to create something bigger than themselves. Gary, the elder brother, had always been the visionary. He had an eye for opportunity and an instinct for business. Ted, younger and fiercely loyal, was a strategist, ensuring the operations ran smoothly. Their bond was unbreakable, forged through tragedy, the loss of their father when Ted was just a baby. In many ways, Gary became more than just a brother. He was a father figure. By 1984, their efforts were paying off. Gary had just returned from Mississippi, where he secured major funding to take their business to the next level. The brothers were on the verge of something great. New locations, new ventures, a future of wealth and success. On the night of September 23rd, 1984, Gary called Ted from Baton Rouge with excitement in his voice. "I got it, Teddy. The funding's locked in. We're going to change everything." "That's amazing, Gary. Come over, let's celebrate." Ted had responded. Gary agreed. He was supposed to arrive within the hour, but Gary never showed up. At first, Ted thought little of it. Maybe Gary got caught up in something. An emergency meeting, car trouble, a last-minute detour. But when the morning sun rose and there was still no sign of Gary, Ted's got twisted with an unsettling fear. Something was terribly wrong. Ted drove to Gary's house, expecting to find him asleep, exhausted from a long night. But as he pulled into the driveway, he saw the front door slightly ajar. The eerie stillness of the house sent a chill up his spine. "Gary," he called, stepping inside. No response. The living room was untouched, the kitchen neat, but there was an odd emptiness. No signs of a struggle. No indications that Gary had been home at all. His car was missing, but that wasn't unusual. It was a silence that felt wrong. Ted's instincts took over. He began calling friends, business associates, and even local hospitals, hoping that Gary had just gotten into an accident. But no one had seen him. Not a single trace. That's when the reality started to sink in. Gary hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Something, or someone had taken him. Ted's desperation turned into a relentless pursuit. He combed the city, driving through the streets of Baton Rouge, stopping at every restaurant, gas station, and business partner's office that Gary might have visited. It was as if his brother had vanished into thin air. For the first time in his life, Ted felt helpless. How could a man disappear without a trace? Just as despair began creeping in, Ted received a call from Larry Tucker, Gary's business partner. Larry had been living with Gary in a shared apartment near downtown Baton Rouge to be closer to work. "Ted, I cleaned up the apartment yesterday. There was this piece of paper with a name on it. Erica. I threw it away, but it fell off. A name. Erica. It was the first and only clue in the entire search. Who was she? A business associate? A friend? A secret?" Ted's stomach churned. Gary had always been a devoted husband and father, but Ted couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he didn't know. Desperate for answers, Ted drove to the apartment. He rifled through the trash, searching for the discarded note, but it was gone, erased. But Larry's memory was sharp. Gary mentioned that I saved him from making a mistake. Something about going out on his wife. Ted's breath hitched. Was Gary involved with someone? If so, could she know what happened to him? Determined, Ted followed the name's only lead, the Baton Rouge nightlife scene. If Erica was more than just a name on paper, someone in town had to know her. Ted's search led him to a dimly lit, smoky club called a Hot Spot, a well-known strip joint on the outskirts of town. The place reeked of cheap whiskey and desperation, its neon signs flickering against the damp Louisiana air. As Ted pushed through the doors, he was met with a bizarre moment. A young woman in heavy makeup locked eyes with him and smiled knowingly. "Gary, you're back already?" His blood ran cold. "No, I'm his brother." The smile vanished. The woman's face drained of color. Ted's heart pounded. Have you seen him? My brother? He was supposed to be home last night. A hesitant pause. A flicker of fear in her eyes. Then a whisper. Yeah, he was here. Last night. He left with Erica. The name slammed into Ted like a hammer. Erica. She was real. But her real name, Ted would soon learn, was Lila Mullah. Lila Mullah wasn't just another dancer at the hot spot. She had a past that read like a tragic novel. Born into a wealthy Ohio family, Lila had once been a promising young woman, a high school honor student, a violinist, a track star, but addiction had swallowed her whole, pulling her into a world of drugs, crime, and survival on the streets. By the time she arrived in Louisiana, she had become deeply entangled with Ronald Dunnigan, a drifter and street performer known for his dark charisma and violent temper. Dunnigan was a shadowy figure, a man who could slip between personas effortlessly. One minute a harmless clown entertaining children, the next a calculating predator with an insatiable hunger for power. Somehow, Lila was under spell. She paid the bills through stripping and sex work. He controlled her every move. They were more than lovers. They were accomplices in something sinister. And now, Gary Carrian had walked right into their web. Ted stood outside the hot spot, his hands clenched into fists. His gut told him Lila Mullah was a key to finding out what happened to his brother. But something about this felt too calculated, too deliberate. Had Gary been targeted? Was his disappearance not an accident, but a premeditated plan? Ted didn't know it yet, but he was about to uncover one of the most horrifying truths of his life. And by the time it was over, he'd come face to face with monsters wearing human skin. To be continued. Ted Carrian stood outside the hot spot, his breath slow and measured, his fists tight. Inside, people were still drinking, still laughing, still dancing. But his world had stopped. His brother, Gary, had walked into this place and never walked out. And now, the name that had been nothing more than a cryptic clue, Erica, was a flesh-and-blood reality. Lila Mullah. Everything inside Ted screamed for action. But something about this wasn't just a disappearance. The weight of it, the strange fear in the dancer's eyes when she realized Gary was missing, felt like something much worse. Gary wasn't just missing. He had been taken. It was 2 days before police officially declared Gary Carrian a missing person. By then, Ted had already done more investigating than the authorities. He had knocked on doors, spoken to club managers, even followed rumors of a high-paying customer named Gary who had fallen for the wrong woman. But then, the investigation took a sickening turn. The police were alerted to an abandoned apartment in Baton Rouge, the last known residence of Lila Mullah and Ronald Dunnigan. The building was a run-down, mold-stained wreck, sitting between a liquor store and a pawn shop. When detectives entered, the stench of old, dried blood hit them like a wall. Blood smeared the walls in violent streaks. Splashes on the carpet. Tiny dark spatter marks on the ceiling, as if something or someone had been struck with brutal force. And then there was the door frame leading to the bathroom. Deep gouges had been carved into wood, as if someone had dug their nails into it. Desperate, clawing for their life. Ted arrived at the scene before the forensic team had even set up. When he saw the blood, his legs almost buckled. That's Gary's blood, isn't it? His voice cracked. The investigator didn't answer right away, but his eyes said everything. A day after discovering the apartment, the police located Gary's missing car, a champagne-colored Cadillac, left in an abandoned lot near the outskirts of Baton Rouge. The vehicle was locked. No keys, no sign of forced entry. But inside the trunk, forensic investigators found the kind of evidence that screams in silence. The lining of the trunk was soaked through with blood. The material was torn in places, as if someone had been thrashing, kicking, dying inside. And worse, long, curved smears of blood ran along the inner walls of the trunk. Handprints. Gary had been alive in there, and he had tried to get out. The moment police connected the apartment and the Cadillac to Lila Mullah and Ronald Dunnigan, it should have been an open-end shut case. But there was one problem. They were gone. Lila and Dunnigan had fled the night after Gary's murder, vanishing from Baton Rouge without a trace. The strip club, the apartment, The few associates they had, it was as if the two had been swallowed by the earth. Authorities issued a warrant, but the leads went cold. That's when Ted took matters into his own hands. Through relentless digging, Ted traced their movements across state lines, following a whisper of their whereabouts from Louisiana to Nevada. The break came in Las Vegas. Lila and Dunnigan weren't just hiding. They were still working. She was stripping. He was pimping. And they were just arrogant enough to walk into a Las Vegas sheriff's office, requesting an escort license for Lila. A routine background check flagged the Baton Rouge arrest warrant. The cops took them down without a fight. With both Lila and Dunnigan in custody, Ted thought it was finally over. Then, investigators found something in their Vegas apartment. Something far worse than even the blood-soaked car. It was Lila's diary. Detectives flipped through pages of madness. Disturbing confessions scrawled in ink. But one entry, written just days before Gary disappeared, froze Ted's blood. Hit Gary next time. Ron will hide in the closet. A plan. A trap. Ted sat motionless as an investigator read the diary entry out loud. They planned this before he even walked into that apartment? Looks that way, the detective said grimly. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated murder. With Lila's diary and the blood evidence, it should have been a straightforward conviction. But then, the case collapsed. Prosecutors knew they needed Lila's testimony to convict Ronald Dunnigan. And to get it, they made a deal. They offered Lila immunity, a full walk, if she turned against Dunnigan. But she refused. She wouldn't testify, wouldn't speak, wouldn't betray the man who controlled her. In the blink of an eye, the prosecution lost their strongest card. With no body, no direct witness, and a refusal to testify, the case against Dunnigan crumbled. Both of them, Lila and Dunnigan, walked free. Ted watched as the people who had murdered his brother left the courthouse untouched. For the first time in his life, he felt true, blinding rage. This wasn't justice. This was a goddamn insult. And Ted Carrian swore on his brother's blood. This wasn't over. The courtroom smelled of old wood and dust, but to Ted Carrian, it smelled like failure. He watched his fist clench as Lila Mullah and Ronald Dunnigan walked free, laughing, even. 30 years. 30 years of nightmares, of unanswered questions, of his brother's blood soaking inside of a trunk. And now, the monsters responsible for Gary's death were walking into the sunlight. Ted wasn't a violent man. He wasn't a killer. But in that moment, he understood how easy it was for someone to become one. This isn't over, he whispered under his breath. Not by a long shot. Ted had spent years building his brother's business. He knew how to grind, how to outlast, how to push forward when every door was slammed in his face. And if the justice system wouldn't do its job, he'd do it for them. For 3 decades, Ted never let them go. He tracked Lila and Dunnigan like a hunter, watching, waiting, gathering information. He didn't have police resources, but what he did have was money, connections, and the unshakable obsession of a man who had lost everything. Lila, as it turned out, had tried to bury her past. She left the sex trade, moved to New York, and reinvented herself. By the early 2000s, she had a nursing degree, 2 children, and the smiling face of a reformed woman. But no amount of reinvention could scrub Gary's blood from her hands. Dunnigan, on the other hand, was a ghost. He drifted through small Louisiana towns, living off disability checks that, according to one of Ted's sources, he faked. But here was the most disturbing part. Dunnigan and Lila never spoke again. Not once. It was like even he knew she was dangerous. That was Ted's first clue. Dunnigan had always been the puppet master, controlling Lila, forcing her into the worst parts of her life. But now, he wanted nothing to do with her. What was he afraid of? Ted knew that if he wanted real justice, he needed hard evidence. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed in court. That's when he caught a break. One of Gary's old business partners had a daughter who was now a district attorney investigator. She had heard the story of Gary's murder growing up, and she wanted to help. The biggest issue was that we never confirmed the blood in the car was Gary's, she told Ted. It had been 1984. DNA testing was primitive at best. But now it could prove everything. They tracked down Gary's son, Wade, now a grown man. He agreed to submit a DNA sample, and forensic scientists retested the blood-soaked Cadillac trunk. The results were undeniable. The blood was Gary's. He had died in that car. It was a final confirmation of what Ted already knew. But knowing wasn't enough. Ted wanted convictions. With Lila and Dunnigan still free, Ted had one option left: play dirty. He recruited a woman he trusted, a friend of a friend, someone charming, clever, and ruthless when needed. Her job? Get close to Dunnigan. Earn his trust. Get him talking. Ted funded her entire life for over a year. Her rent, her car, everything. All she had to do was make Dunnigan believe she was on his side. It worked. Dunnigan was lonely, living in a filthy trailer outside of Baton Rouge. He liked to talk, especially after a few drinks. And one night, he finally said it. I did something bad once. The worst thing you can do. The woman played along. Like what? She asked, her voice light, teasing. Dunnigan's eyes glazed over. We killed a man. Cut him up. Her heart pounded, but she forced a laugh. Yeah, right. Dunnigan leaned in. No, really. Gary, we poisoned him first. Lila did that part. Then I smothered him. Ted was listening in real time from another location. His hands shook as he scribbled every word down. Finally, a confession, with Dunnigan's words recorded. Ted turned the evidence over to authorities. This time, they had enough. Baton Rouge police arrested Lila in New York. Ted was there, watching from the sidewalk, disguised as a homeless man. She looked right at him. Her lips parted. I knew you would come back. When interrogated, Lila finally cracked. She told them everything. Dunnigan had bought poison, testing it on guinea pigs first. Lila had lured Gary in, pretending she wanted to see him. Dunnigan hid in the closet, while Gary drank the poison wine. When the poison didn't work fast enough, Dunnigan smothered Gary with a pillow. Then came the worst part. He cut him up, Lila said, her voice breaking. With what? The detective pressed. A saw, a small one, handheld. The room fell silent. Gary's body had been dismembered. They stuffed him into trash bags, dumped the remains in highway dumpsters, and erased his existence. Or at least, they thought they did. Because now, Ted had brought them all back. With Lila's testimony, the prosecution finally had enough evidence to take Dunnigan down. The trial was swift and brutal. The jury took only hours to deliver a verdict. Lila Mullah, 30 years in prison for her role in the crime. Ronald Dunnigan, life without parole. Ted sat in the courtroom, emotionless as the sentences were read. When Dunnigan was let out in cuffs, he glanced at Ted. A smirk flickered on his lips. Took you long enough. Ted didn't react, because in the end, it didn't matter. Dunnigan wasn't walking out of this one. Gary's body was never found. The dumpsters where he had been discarded were emptied long before the case ever reopened. There was no grave to visit, no remains to bury, just a missing brother and a wound that never fully healed. But Ted had done the impossible. He had spent 3 decades hunting monsters, and in the end, he won. As he left the courthouse, the Louisiana sun blinding in the sky, he whispered, "After 30 years, I got you, you son of a bitch."